Luke and Jordan, hello.
This is not something I normally do much of, so.
Hi, Nadia. Good to see you.
Hi.
Nadia, adjust your screen so that we can see the top of your head.
Yeah, yes, we can only see. Yeah, that's better.
That way?
That's better. Okay.
Well, I have to go and get a couple of big books to put this iPad on.
I don't know. I think it looks all right.
Where's Father Stephen? Okay, you're back. Okay.
Yes, I was just ringing Dr. Nadia, so
yeah,
no,
just to
I am
see
back.
where I was, but I've been having trouble getting messages. So anyway, I got this last one, so with the Zoom Connect. Okay. Who's that?
I love the purple butterflies. Who's got those?
I've got Jordan Peer. I've got some funny little picture in the middle. Oh yeah, the purple butterflies, right?
It's Jordan, yeah.
Very gay.
Oh. Okay. Hang on. Now we've got lots more panelists, I see.
Yes. So
Okay.
Walking around looking for big books. Oh, hang on. This might work, Helen. Could you just move that over for me?
Father Alexander, if you're live streaming this, we don't see those people who are watching that, correct?
No, but I've got 6 people at the moment, but people are coming in and out. Not sure why they're not staying.
Okay, let's see if that works.
Father,
Or is that all my head now?
that's fine. I think.
Yeah.
I think
Father Stephen, I
Yes.
think you should begin as 35, 7:35.
Yes. No, we'll get started. Father Nicholas, would you kindly start us off with prayer?
O Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, right everywhere present and fills all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls a good one.
Thank you, Father. Well, welcome everybody to the last Faith and Wisdom Family Edition talk for 2020. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Father Stephen from the parish here in Canberra. And the purpose of the Faith and Wisdom, sorry, let me turn my phone on silent. The purpose of Faith and Wisdom Family Edition, which we try to run every 6 weeks approximately, is to focus on issues that families are dealing with in raising a family, or the issues that relationships find in the 21st century, and having to deal with 21st century issues, the things that make relationships and families difficult for us. And if we don't have that support from the church and the guidance from the church, then we can be left to kind of have to fend for ourselves, and the advice that we get out in secular society may not be very good. So that's the purpose of this talk, of this series of talks, I should say. Tonight's talk is I think is going to be a really important one, and I'll shortly introduce the 3 panelists who'll be speaking to us tonight. But the topic is, does my relationship with my spouse, the relationship between a husband and wife, what impact does it have on the development of children, and more broadly on the family? And Father Nicholas and I had talked about this topic, and this is quite important. And I think some of you who maybe parents can relate to what I'm about to say. I know Matushka and I spend a lot of time talking together about how we raise our children. We spend an awful amount of time, and are we getting it right, and are we doing the right things? But you know, it's in so many ways the relationship between Matushka and I is fundamentally important to the development of our children, as is the techniques that we use to raise them. And so we have to be conscious of how we deal with each other and how we treat each other and how we serve each other. And so that's what this evening's talk is about. Before I continue, just a few housekeeping matters. The panelists will have, and myself will have, our microphones on. I'd ask everybody else to have their microphones on mute, so that just so we don't have too much sound coming through the speakers and it becomes difficult to hear. If you'd like to ask a question, and the panel would really like people to ask questions. That's what they're here for. And they're not going to do a lot of talking. So we would like to see your questions and find out what it is that you'd like to know about. If you'd like to ask a question, the chat function through Zoom is available, and that's probably the best way. Just type your question in chat. Chris is, as always, providing our IT support and assisting us with maintaining the questions. If you're watching on YouTube Live, you can also submit a question to us. If you would really like to ask a question of the panel or a panel member, then please let us know, and you can unmute your microphone and ask the question directly. That's not a problem as well. In terms of the format, each of the speakers will introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about why they think this topic is important, and some of the points they think that we should be aware of. And then we'll basically open it up to questions and allow people to put forward questions of issues that they would like addressed. Our panel tonight, we have Dr. Nadia Crittenden from Sydney, Father Gabriel from St Nicholas in Brisbane, and we have Tania Pye in Victoria. So we have the whole of the Eastern Seaboard covered, which is the beauty of online meetings like this. So, and I'd just like to start by firstly thanking the panelists for coming. But something that prompted my thinking as to why this topic might be important. Many years ago, and I mentioned this to the panel, many years ago, I read a book about marriage and about families, raising families, and it was set in a Christian context. And one of the quotes I remember, I don't remember a lot about the book because I read it a long time ago, but one quote I remember was, if you want to love your children, love your spouse. And you know, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and we're going to be unpacking some of the issues around that this evening. So I think I'll hand over firstly, Dr. Nadia, would you like to begin us off by providing a brief introduction of yourself and why you feel that this topic is important?
Okay, thanks very much, Father Stephen. I've been counselling for many years and worked with families a lot of that time, and I also taught for many years in the tertiary education sector. I was very interested to be on this panel because I think we live in unprecedented times, actually, and I think that the society we live in now is a very, very difficult one, in which for adults to cope, never mind children. And so the relationship between parents and how they cope is going to be really of vital importance to the development of the children. So I've come across a lot of problems over the years, particularly in the last couple of years when technology has become so pervasive. And I think technology is one of the most important points that parents, or one of the most important conflicts that parents are dealing with now. There are lots and lots of other things that parents are facing these days, not only the problems that existed pre-technology, but all the ones that have come along because of technology. I think the next few years will be critical to the well-being of both adults and children, and I think our Orthodox community has to take very serious note of that and offer what support we can to one another and to our community to do the best we can in very difficult times. So I hope I can be of some use in these times.
Thank you, Dr. Nadia. Father Gabriel, although you don't need a formal introduction, but for those in the other states who may not know you as well, if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why you think this topic is important.
Thank you, Father. Father Gabriel Makarov. I'm rector of St Nicholas Cathedral in Brisbane. And I've been here for 22 years, and prior to that I was in the Geelong parish as rector for 14 years. During that time, there's been ample opportunity to work with youth via conferences, pilgrimages, and so on. So I agree completely with Dr. Nadia that this discussion could easily turn into a discussion on the problems and challenges faced by the youth of today, which may not be its specific aim, but that might be a topic on its own. Why I think this topic is important is because the Christian concept of a family is very special and particular. It's not just about a mother and father raising and enjoying their children and trying to give them the best that life has to offer and so on. There's something much deeper and important than that, and that is that a family, according to the church, is a mini church. It's a mini ark of salvation, and therefore a husband and wife, they have as their prime directive to strive for salvation together with their children, and then at some point equipping their children with the ability to continue this path when they themselves become independent adults. And what's interesting is that there's never been, I fully agree that we live in very unusual times and difficult times, but the truth is that there's never been a time in history when Christians could just fold their arms and say, well, I don't need to be vigilant anymore, or in this particular time because everything is done for me. That's never happened. You know, Satan has never changed his purpose. He may have changed his tactics sometimes and approached different generations of people and societies in different ways, but his purpose has always remained the same. And so it's not surprising that even as early as the 4th century, St. John Chrysostom, he voices his concern about this. He compares raising children to putting a seal into wax. And before the wax is hardened, if you can set that seal in, then it will remain the same once it's hardened, once it's applied, before it's strengthened. And he says that this is the same with children's souls, that once they have hardened, once you put in what you want to put in, then it's very hard for someone else to erase this later. So really, I see this as a kind of a window of opportunity that we receive as parents. And of course, parents who have raised children will tell you immediately that that window of opportunity was much shorter than they anticipated, much smaller. And so we have to take advantage of that. That's why I think this is a very important topic.
I'd just like to interject and say that somebody had their mic turned on. Could you all mute your mics, because it tends to create a little bit of feedback when you're not actually talking.
Thank you, Father. And thank you, Father Gabriel. And last but not least is Tania Pye in Victoria. Tania, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to our guests and telling us a little bit about your thoughts on this particular topic.
Thanks, Father Stephen. Can you hear me all right? Because I did get a lot of interference before it went off the air.
It's very good, very good.
Like Dr. Nadia and Father Gabriel, I feel all those things they've said completely what I feel. But there was an extra sort of dimension to me wanting to join in tonight, and that was because during my working life, I worked also as a psychologist for a couple of decades here in Geelong and saw a lot of family distress. Mainly I dealt with the parents more so than sometimes, of course, adolescent children, but more so dealing with the parents, trying to give them some support in, and clearly they weren't all Christian people. Some were, had no Christian framework. So, but my interest, and particularly why I thought it was so important, this topic, was that, of course, since the beginning of time, parents have had difficulty with children, personalities, etc., will play into different personalities of the parents. But what is different in this unusual time that we live in is that there is a great division between the secular world now and the Christian world has taken a complete back, you know, they're on really, people don't consider even that there is I'm not talking about Orthodox Christians, but generally speaking, if you're working in the community, and possibly even with some Orthodox Christian families, they tend to perhaps be directed to psychologists for counselling, and that counselling now is more difficult than ever because a lot of the counsellors out there don't have a Christian perspective. So, oh, I seem to have lost connection. Oh.
No,
we can, Tania, you're there.
Can you hear it? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, no problem at all.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so my concern was that the disconnect between what is out there to help young families and the Christian perspective, the Orthodox Christian perspective, is a bigger gap than ever. And I think people need to be made aware of the fact that if they have issues, I mean, I remember saying at one of the other talks that we had that, you know, 100 years ago, people would go to their parish priest, their spiritual father, their grandparents who were greatly respected 100 years ago, or even their parents, and they would get the help and advice they need. In the last 50, 70 years, that hasn't been the case, and it's getting worse. So my point really is that I think all parents need to find the right help, the right advice, people that you trust with the right perspective.
Thank you very much, Tania. So, and before I go on, I just wanted to, so I don't forget at the end, I wanted to specifically thank Father Nicholas Cathedral for helping to organise this panel, because I think we have a great team on the panel tonight who have an immense amount of experience and wisdom to share. And so I would ask everybody, make the most of this opportunity. Don't be backward in asking, wanting to ask a question. So let me throw this out to the panel. Does it make a difference how, in terms of the development of my children, does it make a difference how I treat my spouse? If, let's just say, we're trying to use all of the right parenting or good parenting techniques, but let's just say the relationship between the spouses is not that great. What then is the consequence on the children themselves? The panel members can unmute their microphones, by the way. That's probably the easiest way to. Father.
They're all being very polite and wanting the other person to go first.
Well,
maybe you give the orders.
Yes. Tania, your thoughts on, sorry, I think you're on mute. It shows.
Am I on mute now?
No, you're fine. We can hear you now.
Okay, it's interesting, Father Stephen, that you should start with that particular. I did a bit of research on presentations to hospitals, for instance, or presentations of children in crisis. These are the sort of, and parents obviously who can't agree on how to they can't agree on the parenting of their children. These are some of the things that are listed. The disagreement over household rules, the disagreement over discipline, the disagreement over who should discipline the children, fighting in front of the children, inconsistency between the parents, children preventing parents from being alone and having time to discuss things, manipulation, that sort of thing. Children turning, undermining each other, parents favouring one child. It just goes on. There's about 20 things that cause concern with health professionals when children with problems present. And if children see a disconnect between the husband and wife, that is the major problem that inconsistency is the major problem well, it's the start of a great problem for all the family. And children, as we all know, are really perceptive. They'll tap into any disagreement. So it's not a matter that the mother and father can have different views, but it's how those views are handled. And on the major issues, I think there should be agreement between husband and wife to, if they disagree and want to have that when the children are in bed and they have their private time, that's a better way to do it than to have disagreement in front of the children. That's been my experience.
Thank you. And Father Gabriel, you being a parish priest for as long as you have been, I suppose one of the benefits you have is that of perspective in terms of you get to see the whole family unit. So what are your thoughts, Father, on what have your observations been about the impact of the relationship between a mother and a father on the children and on the cohesion of the family unit?
I thought, Father, that you hit the nail right on the head with that quote that you started with, saying that if you want to love your children, you should love your spouse. I think that sums it all up, and there's very little else to say. Look, the truth is that we not only are giving our children an example when we wish to, but all the times when we think we are not. As Tania said, children are very perceptive, and we tend to think that there are certain times when we are trying to give our children good lessons in piety, in morality, and so on. And we think that when we are applying those lessons specifically at that time, that is the learning experience for our children. But of course, it is not. All of the other time, we are providing an example to our children, and maybe not the one that we want. So every parent knows of that terrible moment when they see something in their child that they dislike very much, and they realize that the child is simply a mirror of themselves, of the parents, and then it hits home how vigilant you have to be and how careful. So absolutely, what's the point of talking to your children about not having arguments among themselves, about treating each other right and not bullying and so on, if you are not doing the same in your own adult life for them to see.
Yeah, that's very good, Father Gabriel. Thank you. And Dr. Nadia, your thoughts on the impact of the relationship between mother and father on the development of the emotional and psychological development of the children?
Well, I think Father Gabriel is absolutely right in that children imitate their parents, and they imitate everything. And even as little ones, they start imitating their parents. There was a case where a parent that I happened just to witness a parent having a little bit of a meltdown, and the next minute the child copied the parent exactly, and the child was 3 years old. So that's how early they'll start copying. That's how they learn. They learn by copying their parents. So I think it's very important for parents always to be aware of that whatever they're doing, realise that it's going to come back. It's going to come back at you. But I think probably one of the important things to know is that children are wired to love both their parents. They want to love both. They can't help loving both. So whenever they experience conflict between their parents, it actually causes them pain. They feel torn. They don't know which way to go. And that is probably one of the most serious consequences of conflict between parents. And then to cope and to manage, children then start a whole lot of coping mechanisms, and one of the biggest ones is manipulation. They'll play one parent off against the other. And that's just a coping mechanism to deal with the misery that they feel, because in fact they don't know which way to jump. It causes them later on real problems with truth. If one parent says one thing and another parent says another thing, what's the truth? They're supposed to listen to their parents. How can you listen to how can you make any sense of a conflicting instruction? And I think that in my experience, it's caused children a lot of pain. And when you speak to them later in life, they say, that's what they tell you. They say, you know, as children, my parents fought and it caused me a lot of pain. And I think parents don't realise that children can't articulate pain. They don't know what to say, they just feel it. And then they start to act out and they have behavioural problems. And the parents often don't even connect those behavioural problems with that original conflict or the ongoing conflict that keeps occurring. It's a huge responsibility to have children. You know, if you can't deal with yourself, then you can't deal with your children and you can't teach them to deal with themselves. So that would be my thoughts in the first instance.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nadia, and especially what you said about the fact that the children will mimic their parents. It really does make you stop and think about what you're saying and what you're doing and the tone in which you're doing it. And I'm thinking just about, you know, I've got 2 young children, and I absolutely have to be careful about what I say and do at all times. But of course, that's not always possible. But we've got a few questions that have come in. So let me start off with this one. This is a really good question. What is one thing that we can do as husband and wife on a daily basis to model healthy Orthodox Christian behaviour to our children? Father Gabriel, I think I may have to start picking on people. So, sorry, but
That's fine. It's better that way. One thing, well, it sounds very simple, but stand before God together. Let the child see that they're not just watching their father pray or their mother pray, but that we all pray and we all stand before God. How is a child ever going to learn humility if he never sees his father on his knees before an icon? How is he ever going to understand humility if he never sees the father ask forgiveness of the mother or the mother of the father? Or on days like Forgiveness Sunday, if they don't have the mini ritual at home of bowing to each other and asking for forgiveness and mutually forgiving. In other words, children shouldn't just observe their parents being pious. They should understand that they are included in that whole process of piety. So very simply, just stand before God together as a family, not individually.
I think that is so true, Father, in terms of not setting standards for our children that we're not prepared to keep. You know, how often have we seen parents wanting to send, for example, wanting their children, for example, to go and take communion or do various things, but the parents are not leading by example. So I think that's a very important point. Tania, one healthy thing that couples can do on a daily basis. This seems like quite a basic question.
It is, but a lot of the best advice and the best, I find the best sort of thoughts are very basic and they don't have to be overly complicated. One of the things that I recently read in one of the books of the Holy Fathers was spend time with your children. They have so many questions. Spend time. I mean, it's interesting, since I've known that I'll be talking, I find myself thinking on a daily basis. You churn up your own life and you think about it, and you certainly become very aware of how other people are around you. The advice from someone I trust someone said to me, why don't you ask some people that you really admire, that have raised families that are such strong people. Some of these people I'm talking about don't necessarily have formal educations, but they are the pillars of strength. And so, you know, if you talk to your children, if you take the example of people you trust and admire, I don't think you can go far wrong. I think that was, you know, it doesn't have to be complicated. I'll just give you an example of how, if you observe, if you're thinking about I did a ferry crossing recently, last week, over to the other side of the bay here. It's a beautiful crossing. From a nature point of view, you wouldn't want anything more beautiful on God's earth. The bay and the scenery is beautiful. And across from me in the boat was sitting a woman who had 2 young children, maybe 7 and 5, and she didn't look up from her phone for the whole 40 minutes of the trip. And it just seems to me that it actually she was either on her phone or texting or calling someone. And apart from a missed opportunity, it kind of drove the point home to me what young parents are facing now, the overlay of technology on top of everything else. So to answer your question, spend time with your children, talk endlessly. Whatever they want to ask, whenever, that can be just as simple as that.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, and I suppose I don't know about yourselves, but we see it among, you know, father and mother sitting on the same couch together, both on the phones, and there's no communication going on. No one's talking to the other person. So, and I think that sends a very strong signal to the children as to where their interest is. And it's really disappointing. But then it carries through to the children who spend a lot of time in front of their screens as well. So you have a real disconnect in the family. Thank you, Tania. Dr. Nadia, your thoughts on this important question of one daily thing we can do to model a healthy relationship to our children?
Well, my thoughts on that are that children love their parents. Their parents are visible to them. If they love their siblings are visible. If they love grandmothers, grandfathers, they're all visible. And yet we ask our children to love God. So I think that the one thing that would really, really help each day is to teach children something about God through the person of Jesus. So through the scriptures, through the way Jesus behaved, how he behaved with people, the sorts of things he did and said, one small thing a day will gradually make God real for them. Because Jesus himself said, if you've seen me, you've seen God. So if we can teach them some small thing that will make them think of Christ as a real person who lived on earth and who did things, and to get to know him as a personality, because there are extreme riches in the Gospels about him. If you read them carefully and often, all the different things he did and said present a very, very amazing picture of an amazing person. And I think if we can make our children aware of that person, then when we say love God, they will know who they're loving and why.
Thank you, Dr. Nadia. And following on from that, there's a follow-up question, and that is, what if, in terms of the daily habit or habits we can display to show a healthy orthodox relationship to anyone on the panel, what if both parents are not orthodox, or what if in fact the parents are separated? Have you got any advice? And that, I mean, that really makes it, especially if the parents are separated, it can make it more complex to display a healthy relationship. Hopefully there is a healthy relationship going on. I have to say my experience in family law demonstrates that quite often the spouses are not on good terms, and continue that way well after the divorce. So any advice that the panel can give on what if both the parents are not Orthodox, or what if they're separated in terms of the daily habits of displaying a healthy Orthodox relationship?
That's probably one of the most difficult questions that this panel is going to have to face. If I start off by saying that separated parents have an even bigger responsibility to their children, because once again, the children are wired to love both parents, and a bit of an argument at home is one thing, but separating parents is virtually tearing your children apart. On the other hand, parents who can't live together without extreme anger and violence, the children are better off without that as well. So it's an extremely difficult question, I think. As far as orthodoxy goes, well, if it's a mixed marriage, then that's something that should be sorted out before the marriage as to what each party is prepared to concede. If the Orthodox person says, well, I want my children to be baptized Orthodox and I want them to be brought up as Orthodox children, and the spouse agrees, then that's one agreement. Now, often spouses do agree, but then they renege on that agreement later on and leave the parents with a really difficult problem. If they can't work something out, then they have to know that they're headed for very, very rocky waters, because children won't know what to think. You'll bring up children who are very, very confused. If they have one person saying, believe this, and another person saying, particularly another person saying, well, it's not scientific, and etc. It's not an easy one at all. Maybe Father Gabriel has some interesting thoughts as a priest who perhaps counsels mixed couples before marriage as well as after.
Ask any priest about the grief that he has to observe.
Yeah.
These kind of families.
Yeah.
Whenever I'm conducting marriage discussions before marriage with young couples, I always say that although mixed marriages are a fact of life, they are an unfortunate fact, because every marriage should really be between two Orthodox people as far as we are concerned. But real life demonstrates that that's not always the case. And the way I try to impress this on couples preparing for marriage is by saying that when a couple is walking together in their marriage on the same page, then it's like soldiers marching. Left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. There's a force, there's a movement, there's a power, there's a purpose. In a mixed marriage, it's a little bit different. It's left, right, left, right, left, right, the other person, right, left, right, left, right, left. So there's still movement, there's still a force, but something is not quite right. And that not quite rightness usually shows itself later in the marriage, never at the beginning in most cases. It may be when at the onset of something very wonderful, like the birth of a child or something like that, where at least one, usually the mother, suddenly feeling the connection between herself and her child, begins to experience spiritual feelings, being responsible for another soul, answering before God for another soul. And suddenly the couple realize that they're not on the same page. But it also could come on, the onset of it could be because of a tragedy. Someone dies close to the family or something like that, a close relative, and people start thinking of their mortality. And, it's incredible when you sometimes see couples who had everything going for them and had all of the greatest plans in the world, and then they realize they're not on the same page. They are completely divided purposes. So in a mixed marriage, the person who is Orthodox, they carry a particular type of cross. And the best advice I heard concerning this to give to an Orthodox member of the marriage who now is feeling the grief of this and the burden was surprisingly from a bishop who had never been married. And he said, look, what I try to do, he said, is impress usually on the woman, right? Because now she's suddenly experiencing all these spiritual feelings, and he sees that her husband is motivated by other things, but it could easily be the other way around. And he said, and what do you do normally as a young wife? You start poking at your husband and picking on him and saying, look, I went to church today, you didn't. I'm fasting, you're not fasting, you know, and so on and so on, and then trying to raise the children in the same concept. And so without actually saying it, what she is teaching her husband is that my wife plus the church, my wife plus her going to confession, my wife plus her going to communion, my wife plus her discussions with her spiritual father equals bad for me. It equals problems for me. It equals unhappiness for me. And so the bishop said, what I try to instill in the mother in this case, or the wife, is to say, look, why don't you reverse things? Think about this, because you may be doing this without thinking deeply. And that is that every time you do go to church, every time you do go to confession, you receive Holy Communion, it's a special kind of feast day, or the fast begins, be an extra nice wife to your husband, or be an extra nice husband to your wife, without saying anything, so that like a child, the husband or the wife learn that my spouse, plus her connection with church and the sacraments and discussions with her spiritual father, equals happy marriage for me. And one day that non-Orthodox partner may turn around and say, this is wonderful what I see in my spouse. I want that for myself. But, you know, that's something we can only hope and pray for.
Thank you, Father Gabriel. Tania, there's a question here specifically for you. What if only one parent is capable of consistency, i.e. due to executive function? I'm not sure I understand the executive function part. But what if only one parent what if only one parent is not capable of consistency?
The executive function usually refers to people that have had some sort of insult, brain injury, or perhaps, you know, it's a term used, for instance, people who have dementia lose their executive functioning. Right. So I'm not quite sure of this particular case, of course, but it does strike me that one parent, if there is love, the discussion before was interesting because I found myself thinking the discord, like Dr. Nadia said, the discord between husband and wife, and particularly if it leads to a divorce, is such a dramatic situation for the children. But there's also the other, in a life, certainly in my personal experience and my professional experience, sometimes other members of the family, parents, parents-in-law, sisters, brothers, one of them can cause grief. And getting back to that, one thing that we can do to show the children, lead by example, I think, is to teach them to forgive and to be humble in the face of perhaps another person's anger, and explain that they are like that for a reason, rather than respond in kind. But getting back to the question that you just asked, if only one parent is able to deliver, well, that parent has an extra burden. And if that parent's conscious of the fact that they're carrying that extra burden, then they need to step up to the mark. I don't think, if it's a parent that perhaps doesn't understand, or the Orthodox way or whatever, it's not the not understanding that's a problem for most children. It's the conflict that causes the worst problems, because an adult who is perhaps in a mixed marriage, who is not confrontational, and who perhaps, you know, in Father Gabe's advice, does take, you know, if they have a harmonious relationship, that won't be a problem, and nor will perhaps a parent who isn't able to teach their children much about orthodoxy, providing the one parent who is responsible steps up to the plate and provides what is needed. It's about that parent taking that extra responsibility. Children soon work it out for themselves if they see that people, their father, or in this case possibly, is being treated with respect. They take that as an example. They won't get distressed, but if there's discord, that's when the distress comes in.
Thank you, Tania. And actually, I want to pick up on a point that you've just raised and address this question to the panel. Somebody's asked a question: isn't it a good idea to allow our children to see their parents arguing and then working through that argument and then reconciling, so that the children can understand how to work through problems? What are your thoughts on, because I mean, there's no such thing as a perfect marriage. It just, you know, well, if it does, I've never seen it, but we all know that if, you know, you've got two people who they're separate individuals, they have their own way of thinking, they have their, no matter how much in common they have, there will come a time of conflict. So is there a problem with allowing the children to see the parents argue and then work through that and then reconcile, or is there another way of doing it? Father Gabriel, thank you.
It seems like a very fine line to me, to let children observe parents arguing, unless you're, well, you have to be very careful, but of course, it's an invaluable lesson for children to see parents make up and forgive each other. So as long as that's the way the argument or disagreement ends, that's a wonderful thing. I think that this is a question for, say, Nadia or Tania, because my concern would be that oftentimes the case may be that one of the marriage partners is very, very submissive, and therefore the other one abuses this submissiveness by being overpowering and overbearing all the time. And they may project the wrong image to their children as well. Because, you know, people need to stand up for themselves in the right way, in the right context, but not just learn to be submissive because mama was always submissive and never paid into the argument and always gave up her position. You know, that may be good from a point of view of, you know, Christian piety and, say, humility, but there can be pitfalls in that too, I think, for raising children in our current society. So I think that's more for the psychologists.
Tania, would you like to say something about that, and then I can add something?
Well, all I can say is I don't think we should manufacture arguments for the just to teach children how to resolve. But children will learn if they're confident and they grow in security and confidence and humility and forgiveness. That's all in the pot with children that are most likely to resolve arguments in the right way in their own relationships in life. A secure child will always defer to, even if it's not particularly maybe even the parents they respect. In many cases, I've heard people say, I love my grandma. You know, who could ever, let's not forget we're talking about orthodoxy here, and we've got to mention the babushki. You know, I mean, they play such a huge role in most cases in the stability that a child, grandparents in general, babushki and the grandfathers, and I think it's much better to talk rather than for the parents to think that argument is the way to go because they might resolve it in the end. That's just the way. It's a personal view and a professional view. I don't think arguing, of course you're going to get different opinions. They should not have to lead to an argument though. There might be other things happening, I don't know, with people. You know, there's lots of agendas that come out when you raise children, and of course there'll be differing opinions, but yep, resolving them, I think, by talking with the children. You know, and I used to suggest to people who, for instance, had busy lives, that they make some time to sit down and treat their children with the respect to say, you know, what do they feel, what's happening for them. Some time set aside for the children. That's a good way to resolve some arguments.
I agree, actually, completely, that, and particularly with not every disagreement has to be an argument. And I think that we can teach our children, we can educate our children, let them know that people disagree all the time, because we're not all the same. And so lay down a rational framework for disagreement, and then try to avoid turning disagreements into arguments. Although I don't think it hurts children to have a little bit of reality there either, because wherever they go in life, as they grow, they'll come across people arguing and disagreeing, and some will disagree very, very well and very politely, and some will be really horrible. So, you know, it doesn't, I think in families, we don't want the horribleness, but they will come across it in life, and there's no way of protecting them from that. In due course, when they go to school and they go up higher, then they grow up and they go into the workplace. Some workplaces can be very, very toxic. And not all arguments are loud and verbal. Some are really horribly silent, where the conflict is silent and horrible. And so I think really we need to very gently and in very small ways educate them about about life and about people, the good as well as the difficult, without setting them up to be judgmental, but simply to understand what goes on. And that's not an easy thing to do, because it has to, the timing's everything. So I think that one piece of advice that I remember, which my mother gave me actually, and which my parents did observe always, and that's no matter, and they disagreed about lots of things. They're both very, very volatile, strong people, and they disagreed, but the language they used was very important. And I remember my mother saying, you know what, you can disagree, but don't ever use bad language towards one another. Don't ever use bad language towards one another. And then the disagreement can be resolved. But once you use bad language, it becomes a personal attack. And that's much, much more difficult. That requires a great deal more. And the children, you know, you can sense the difference in children when it goes like that. That's ugly. Children can, they're very flexible, but ugly they don't like, and ugly affects them a lot. So so I'd say that, you know, don't be too afraid of disagreements, but teach them what that's about. And gentle dislike, you know, with a book or something that you've read, say, well, I like that book and I don't like that book. Why not? And have a discussion about disagreements, so they understand that you can discuss a disagreement and come to a point either where you resolve it, or else you agree to disagree, which is okay too. You can do that very peacefully. So that would be my thoughts on that question.
Thank you, Dr. Nadia. And actually, you raise a really important point about making it personal, because so often disagreements, you know, can turn into arguments, and once they get personal, that's when it becomes quite destructive.
Particularly when it becomes really, really negative criticism, because once your child learns that, they've got a very difficult and nasty weapon in their hands. It's, you might as well, you know, give them some awful weapon and tell it to point at people, because you can say some terrible things to people.
Yes.
And so what we say and how we say it, I think, once again, our children imitate us.
Yes. Thank you. Next question. We've got quite a few coming in, so I'll keep moving through them. How can both husband and wife set boundaries for their family and children that are respected? For example, church, if I'm getting this right, Orthodoxy, Christianity, boundaries, those types of boundaries, that family members or community may not understand. And I think this is...
It's a very fair question, I think, because
it's a
I
very
don't think
good,
anyone
very
has
good
not
question.
faced that question. Yes.
Dr. Nadia, would you like to?
Oh dear. Setting boundaries, first of all, that's you've got to set boundaries by agreement. If you set boundaries by force, they won't work. So you've got to discuss boundaries, and you've got to set boundaries where everybody benefits from the boundary in one way or another. And you need to explain what the benefit is for the parents, for the children, and that the boundaries are not simply mum and dad saying this is the way it's going to be because we're mum and dad, although there's a place for that too. But in any event, it's not just that. It's saying we're setting these boundaries for these reasons. It's going to make everybody's life better to have these boundaries, and allow the children to participate in that boundary setting to a certain extent. I mean, they have boundaries too, and very often adults cross children's boundaries without any thought at all. They don't even recognise that children have boundaries. The worst cases of that, of course, are child abuse, but in ordinary life too, children have quite benign, nice little boundaries that you've got to really watch them and understand them and allow them to have those, because they'll need them. So it's a matter of understanding your boundaries and why you're setting them too, because people can have a lot of motives for setting boundaries. They can be very convenient. So one has to, again, humility is the important thing here. That are you setting the boundaries for yourself or for the family, or what are they for? Is it simply to have control? That's another very difficult one. People who, I remember reading from one Holy Father that you are ready to embark on a spiritual life, a true spiritual life, when you lose any desire to control any other human being. So, which I thought was very, set me thinking a lot, and I think it's true actually. You should not want to. Maybe you have to at times for some reason or other, but you shouldn't want to ever control another human being. It's not our domain. God gave us free will. He doesn't control us. He guides us, but he doesn't control. And that's what I think a lot of parents need to maybe think about a little bit, because the distinction isn't always clear. What's the difference between guidance and control? And I think that's an interesting thing to ponder. I think it's a big difference, and I think children feel the difference. So that's the boundaries one. The other what was the second part of that question? Because that disturbed me even more.
That family members or the community may not understand.
Yes. No wonder I put that in the bag and tried to hide it. Look, this is one that has existed ever since Christ's time, really. People didn't understand then. They didn't understand historically. They won't understand now. That's something any person who has not been a Christian and then becomes a Christian will tell you what an enormous change it is to them, that they could not even imagine beforehand what it is they can see now. So I think that, and I think that's scriptural too, where it says that, that it's spoken to them in parables, lest their eyes be opened, lest their ears be opened, lest they understand and be converted. So it's a known thing that there are many people who are not going to understand, and I don't think there's any way we can make them. That's again God's domain. We can do everything to help by living, and that's again living by example is the thing that I've found the most useful. I know one woman who works in a fairly difficult workplace, and she just consistently maintains courtesy. And she's worked with some very rude people, and she's very patiently maintained courtesy. And, sooner or later, even the mean ones start being polite. And I think it's that sort of example in the end that'll win. Just patient consistency, it can do a great deal. And I think if we're in an environment where people don't understand, I mean, we Orthodox are a bit lucky, because I worked in the university sector, and it was not a particularly friendly Christian sector. There was some very good Christians there, but they were in the minority, and there was quite a lot of gentle ridicule and sometimes not so gentle ridicule. But Orthodoxy was much left alone a little bit, because it's a bit exotic. It's not as in fact, people would say things like, "Do you actually believe in God?" So And if they knew any history, of course, they wouldn't be asking those sorts of questions, but they kind of leave you alone because you're a bit exotic. And if you can hold your own in the workplace, well, you know, you can get by. But so, you know, Orthodox people are a bit lucky. We're not as high profile. We're not as high profile. I think that we have much better reasons for our faith than many of the current versions. But, you know, I don't know, it's a difficult area. I've got a lot of friends who are born again Christians, and you know, what's that other thing where they sing a lot and stuff, and they're nice people. They're nice people, and I wouldn't you know, I wouldn't dream of trying to say, you know, whether they're wrong or they're right. I don't know. I've just found that orthodoxy is strong. It's very strong. So if they don't understand, my take on that would be just live your life. If they ask you questions, answer them. If they don't ask you, well, it's the sort of person you are that's going to affect people more than what you purport to believe.
Thank you, Dr. Nadia. And if I can continue this question, Tania, this is a really good question, but I think it becomes even more acute when it's coming, possibly when the criticism is coming from family members.
Oh, yes.
The outside world is one thing. I can understand it when society says, you know, what you know, you kind of, that's how you raise your children. They pray and do all these sorts of things. But it becomes even more difficult when it's coming from within your own family. Tania, what are your thoughts?
Well, luckily I've had lots of experience, so I'm on that score, and different members of the family I have at various times made comments such as, why do the men have to stand on one side? Here in our little parish they do. Lots of things like that. There you learn to recognise them as just markers of people perhaps not knowing what to say. They have to say something, you know, like Dr. Nadia, I came to Geelong, you know, quarter of a century ago and said I was Russian Orthodox to the first families I met at school, and they also said, well, do you believe in God? What's that? You know, it was that sort of thing, completely off the radar. That's okay, because we found that by living the orthodoxy rather than just saying I am, slowly we were able to convince is the wrong word really, but the children came on board and they were able to say, well, no, I'm not having Easter eggs before Easter because we're on Lent. That sort of strange language that perhaps Australians weren't really interested in or had heard of. It's just a matter of standing up to be counted, and kids will do that if you give them the confidence. I agree with Nadia that orthodoxy was a bit exotic on that score, and I found the Catholics were coming in for a shellacking and they pretty much left Orthodox alone. But you know, at the end of the day, you do come in for a lot of ridicule, criticism. It's okay. It has to really, you have to treat it. My mother used to say, before you get hurt, look who it's coming from. So it's a matter of people not understanding, people are perhaps scared, they're confronted. It shouldn't be something that you treat as an affront, or quite the opposite, treat it as an opportunity to explain to people. But yeah, quite often it comes from within friends and family, and I've certainly had a lot of it in my time. So you learn to just recognise it. Actually, it doesn't sort of disturb me or anything. Yeah.
No, I'd agree. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think one of the difficult ones is when they say that you're brainwashing your children, you're not giving them a chance. That's a hard one. But there's a lovely YouTube from Russia, a Russian priest. I don't know if anyone's seen it, where he talks about that, and he says that well, on that principle, that's fine. Don't teach your children to wash. When they're 20 or so, they can make up their own minds whether they want to have a bath or not have a bath. And a lot of other examples like that, where, you know, you're brainwashing your children by telling them to be clean, or you're brainwashing, etc. And it's a lovely little talk. It really, but I think that's a hard one because I think the reverse is true. You also can brainwash your children not to believe anything. So, you know, it's hard sometimes to listen to.
Father Gabriel, your perspective on this question, because when a husband and a wife, a man and woman get married and become husband and wife, they're establishing a new church in their home. And they're responsible for their home. But then what do they do? And this is, can I say, I think this is possibly one of the most important questions for this evening, because one of the reasons we started Faith and Wisdom Family Edition is because a lot of families are feeling intimidated by the outside world, by the way they want to raise their families and the boundaries they want to set. Your thoughts, Father, on this question, especially coming from the outside or even from family members themselves?
Well, if you follow through from the concept of a family being a mini church or a mini ark of salvation, then when we go to church, we see a certain kind of strictness. We can't just conduct ourselves in the church during services the way we would at a social event or in a park or a picnic. So I think that I'm an advocate for stricter parenting within certain boundaries, and I understand that that's a very sweeping statement, but generally on the stricter side. I know from my own upbringing, for example, and I think this is a very pertinent example, whenever it was Lent, we had one of these TVs that had these sliding doors that would just close. It was a cabinet with a TV, and you just slide, it just looked like a nice piece of furniture. So whenever Lent started, my parents would close that cabinet. And I can't remember, but I think very early in the piece, there was even a lock placed on it. But later I saw that there was no lock, but for me, it was still locked. And as we grew older, we just understood that during Lent, this cabinet closes, and we didn't dare open it, even though we may have had the opportunity. So going back to that concept of, you know, parenting, as parents, you're given a window of opportunity to instill the right kind of principles into your children's hearts and souls. And that window is not open for a long time. Whatever you do instill at that time, that is really of great worth, because children can use that as a foundation to build on later. I must say that as a priest, it's a little bit easier for me, because when people come to me to talk about any of these problems, and young people or parents, I don't have to pretend that I'm unbiased. I say straight away, I'm the most biased person you're ever going to meet. If this is sinful or this is wrong or immoral, I'm going to tell you. I'm not going to pretend it's okay. You know, I understand that the problems that counselors and psychologists face, because they have to, you know, professionally distance themselves from their own personal views and so on. I don't think I'm even capable of doing that. But I also suspect that most counselors and psychologists aren't really capable of doing that, because the person going to them still gets a feeling whether they're talking to a Christian advisor or a non-Christian advisor and so on. Well, that's the kind of feedback that I've been given at any rate. Look, the crux of all of this is in terms of your children and being able to get them to stand on their own 2 feet. Really, the pivotal point is the point at which you can observe or help them to not just act like Christians, but to be Christians. Because the very simple adage that Christianity isn't a teaching, it's not a club, it's a way of life. And when you can adopt that principle, then everything else seems to be a lot easier. But as long as you're just trying to be a Christian, then you're faced by all of these hurdles. And then you have to go through well, probably what every Christian Orthodox family has gone through with their children. Oh, you know, don't worry, it's wonderful. You have 2 Christmases instead of 1. You know, there's the old calendar and the new calendar, or there are 2 Easters. Well, that's all right. You know, you get 2 sets of holidays and so on and so on. But you know, that's fine with young children. But a time comes when they have to be able to explain why. And that's the point where you have to say to them, you know what, we are a Christian Orthodox family, and being a good Christian is tough in this world. It's not an easy thing. So get ready for it. And if you can't defend your principles or can't, you know, embark on some sort of apologetics to defend your faith, well, don't. You're not required to know everything, but just step back and don't pay into those situations if it's possible. But make that the impotence for going home and learning more about your faith. You know, I suppose that we're talking about the transition of children from being, you know, just children who accept everything that they're given to those who begin thinking for themselves and start asking the questions. And of course, I think all sensible parents understand that that's the time you need to provide a lot of attention to your children and sit down and talk with them and let them voice their concerns and the difficulties that they're having. And you let them take ownership for some of the decisions that they make. You know, it was said earlier that, you know, some of these things need to be discussed with children and their opinion asked as well. And you may have to make allowances. You know, I know lots of families who say, all right, well, okay, if there's no other way, then at least come to church on a Saturday night, put up a candle and be anointed with the oil, and then go out with your friends if it's absolutely necessary. Yeah, there can be all sorts of agreements like that reached within reason, and without, you know, transgressing any boundaries. But you know, children have to know that we are heading for a particular goal. We are moved by a particular kind of understanding, and it's not always going to be easy. You know, and I guess some children are going to reject that and need more work.
What do you say, Father Gabriel, when a serious young person asks the question, why is it better to be a Christian? What's the point? If it's a serious question, why is it better to be a Christian than to live in a secular world and go for success or whatever?
Well, yeah, I can only quote the Apostle Paul, that we have to be ready to give an account for the things that give us hope. It gives us hope in a hopeless world.
Yep. Yes. Because young people these days really want concrete answers to things. And that is a very good answer. Because you know, I think that the value of hope is being more and more recognised at the moment.
Thank you, Father. And Father Alexander just held up a sign, God is good for you. It's a book. So I just realised. Thank you, Father. But the next question, this is a question which has been around probably since the beginning, the very start, and that is, what happens when there is strife in the spouse's family? This is when the broader family gets involved. Even if there is forgiveness on one side, but the spouse's family makes inadequate remarks or dismisses one of the parents. You know, it's that whole adage of, you're not just marrying the person, you're marrying the family as well, and which is very true. You can't, you know, unless you do a geographical and move to the other side of the world, often you have to live with their extended family. So in that situation, what is your advice when we have strife on one or potentially both sides of the family? Tania.
Oh, I was hoping you wouldn't pick on me. Let me see. That's interesting because it's very difficult. Strife has a life of its own, And sometimes if the participants try to solve things, the whole situation implodes. So my response would be very guarded. Go to people you trust. Go to people like the priest who will, I mean, it's interesting, Father Gabriel brought up the point just before about psychologists in general. Nadia and I were talking about this recently, that you, as a psychologist, I found it almost impossible not to say what I wanted to say, to let the person in front of me sort of know where I was coming from. It's just not possible to suggest things to do for people without having the background. With you know, if you, anyway, that's just another. But so I more and more, and particularly as I reach retiring age, I realised that you have to say to people that you have a Christian perspective, an Orthodox Christian perspective, and then you let them decide whether they want to talk to you. And it's the same with if someone came to me with that particular situation that you've described, I would be highly recommending they go to see a priest, because, you know, situations handled wrongly can be lifelong ramifications. So you need someone with a spiritual, who has experience and the spiritual perspective. Psychologists, perhaps we learn things and we muddle through life, but ultimately we look to our pastors for support. It's as simple as that. You know, so if you get a family and those particular disagreements that you're talking about, where in-laws are involved, they are very complicated situations. Of course, if someone isn't Christian and they're that's a different matter. But if it's an Orthodox Christian family, I think go to the source, because as Father Gabriel said, they will be able to. They have experience. They have families themselves. That's what I'd be suggesting.
Yes, I'd agree with that. I think it's a very difficult situation. I think generally that it's only the couple in the marriage who actually know what's going on. I don't think anyone outside the marriage actually knows what's going on. It is a mystery. It's a very powerful mystery, and I think you can. I think outsiders, and that means extended family, can misconstrue. I think I said in a talk recently, it's never about what it's about, and that's for everybody. That's for everybody. So every extended family member who gets involved in a marriage ought to know, first of all, question why they're getting involved. And I'm not talking about cases of obvious abuse and so on. I'm talking about just, where they just don't happen to like what's happening. And I think they should offer the couple support rather than criticism. I think if you if a couple are married in the Christian sense, they're one flesh. If you start beating up one side, you're also beating up the other. And extended families should know that you can't just go in and criticise one without it affecting the other, and you're damaging yourself and your relationship with them more than anything. I think it's very, very, very delicate ground indeed.
Father Gabriel.
Yep.
The husband and wife are on the same page in terms of practical goals and spiritual life, then they become more impervious to these attacks from outside.
That's true, absolutely.
I think that it seems to me that the best way to deal with these kind of situations is to cement the relationship better, because you can't keep watching your back all the time. And
that's right.
And these things become very convoluted and can become very ugly, as has been said by Tania and Nadia. Most priests will tell you that when they counsel couples who have been married for some time, unfortunately, sometimes you have to counsel couples where the whole object is damage control now, right, to save a marriage. I think that in most cases, priests would agree that the biggest problem in the marriage is lack of communication between the husband and the wife. So
Yeah.
I say to couples, talk until you're sick of talking, talk until you become nauseated by this, but talk it out. And then if you may simply have to agree that when you're in the company of extended relatives and so on, to just observe the rules of common courtesy and respect and nothing else, and don't respond to anything else. Don't let it affect you, because nothing changes the fact that you are the family charged with bringing up your children together and saving your souls together, whatever may be happening outside of the ark, let's say, right?
Thank you, Father. And can I just pick up on this, on another question that touches on extended family, but not necessarily in terms of conflict. And I might, just because of time, I was thinking that we would run till about 9 o'clock, because that's pretty much an hour and a half, which doesn't give us much more time. So I might cover maybe a couple more questions. We have a few there, and then we may have to leave it there. But Father Gabriel, because I just want to pick up on something you said. What if, the scenario being, what if you've got extended family, and that extended family assists you with the children, grandparents and so forth, as is the case for a lot of couples, but they have conflicting teachings to your teachings as parents. This is a hard one, because if it's grandmother and grandfather, that relationship is important. But what if grandmother and grandfather have conflicting teachings themselves? What should we be doing in that situation? And especially if we're placing them in their care.
I think everyone understands now that the time is no longer when a village raises a child. These days, not every family is capable of raising their child. And the truth is, lamentably, that whatever you are not prepared to teach your child and instill in them, someone else may do so, and it may be contrary to what you would have liked. So you just have to be careful, even with schools now, unfortunately, with teachers, with respected professional people who in the past, had free rein with our children, because everyone understood that they would only try to give them the best kind of advice and examples. And unfortunately, we see that even within families, this is not always advisable or appropriate. If you have to leave children in the care of grandparents, and I know these kind of situations, terrible situations where, a grandparent is actually teaching a child about witchcraft and things like that, but in an acceptable way, as good magic, as white magic, which the parents were shocked to find that out. Well, you just have to make some decisions, some difficult decisions, whether you may have to forego on some of the things that are essential to you, because it more often than not, the reason for having the children in care of such people like grandparents is because you need to work and you need 2 incomes and so on. Well, maybe you need to relook at that. Is it worth the cost, the price that you will pay for that? Sometimes it's simple enough to talk to those grandparents and say, look, please, this is what we would like, but more often than not, it is not possible and they will not understand. So maybe parents need to relook at their priorities. And of course, the children are of the right age, then sit down and say to them, look, and that's a difficult thing, that there are some things that are contrary to, as you know, to our Orthodox upbringing and goals and Christian life. And unfortunately, grandma doesn't understand these things either. But I think that's not, you can't just apply that rule for every child, but there may be situations where you have to. Parents just have to reassess their priorities and talk to like-minded parents and find some sort of solution that would work where you don't have to rely on these contrary kind of sources of assistance. It's parenting is tough. It's not for wusses.
Mm-hmm.
It's the hardest thing you'll ever do.
Yes, it is the reality now. That, and perhaps it always was. Yeah, it's a tough thing, and sometimes you have to forego many things that you could allow yourself. For this, I don't mean just to turn your children into people who get everything they desire, but when it's moral principles, you have to sometimes say, well, we could do this and this, but we will tailor our life in such a way because we think it's worth it to give our children the next 10 years in this kind of environment. It's not always possible, but it's something we can at least strive for.
Thank you, Father. And I've got one last question and I'll direct this at Dr. Nadia and Tania, and not necessarily in that order. But can you just speak to us for a moment about the impact that the relationship between a father and a mother has on the children in terms of their ability or the way they will approach developing relationships of their own? What is there a link there? And how important is it then for the relationship between the parents to be healthy in order to help them develop healthy relationships? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Tania, would you like to kick off that one?
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that if the relationship between the husband and wife, the mother and father, is a grown-up relationship, let's just put it that way, where there isn't an imbalance of, someone telling someone all the time what to do. Men have to be men, and the women have to be women. I really believe that both the husband and wife have so much to bring to the table in the traditional roles, and even though that's not a popular thing to say now, but that's part of the problem that we have in our society, is that we've lost that complete definition of what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman. And I think if that relationship is healthy and strong, once again, the children will be so perceptive to see that, and they will be able to, for instance, say when they form their relationships, they will no doubt be looking for the same things that gave them security in their childhood years. So, and when I think back to our experience, my experience, and you have strong parents, you have strong grandparents, you model yourself on that. You become aware of what it is that you can bring to a relationship, and of course, talking to people. I remember years ago, Father Gabriel said, I think when someone comes to him, a young person, and says, well, how do I know that that person's going to be a good wife or husband to me? And I remember him saying something that went along the lines, well, does that person go to church? Does that person take communion? Does what it's does that person reflect the values that perhaps you've had in your life? And it doesn't always work out that way, because we can't ever choose our children's husbands and wives, but at least you give them the best shot at being replicating what you hold dear.
Yes, there's quite a lot of research that says that people in their relationships, beyond family, look for familiarity. There's where they look at the conditions of choices of friends and so on. It's familiarity. It's where people have a lot in common with people and understand that you will be more attracted to. I mean, obviously the opposite can happen, but for the long term and for stable relationships, people tend to seek what they're familiar with because they know how to relate in that circumstance. So I think that I would agree that that you need to set that. You need to be the sort of parent. I think parents should ask themselves: do I want my children to have friends like me? Do I want them to behave? Do I want my children's friends to behave the way I behave and be the sort of person I am? Because 10 to 1, that's the sort of people they're going to feel drawn to over the course of their lives, particularly in their more mature relationship, because you're comfortable with what you know. And there's always the exception, but usually, even with it, when an exception is chosen, usually at some time or other, there comes a point where you realise what the familiar thing was that drew you, even to somebody who didn't seem so similar. There's still something there that you feel that is there. And then that often comes to light a bit later. And it might be something quite unusual. I mean, our partners can surprise us a great deal, always.
Nadia and Tania, I'm surprised that neither of you has brought up the fact, since we're talking about the influence of parents on their children, that there is this phenomenon where, boys will try to marry girls who remind them of their mother, right?
Yes, well, that's a very difficult topic because wives tend to resent that. Wives tend to resent the fact that the only reason you married me is because I remind you of your mother, and young men too can be quite freaked out by that. They don't want to see their mother's face when they look at their wife. So it's a very tricky topic, that one.
But by the same token, I've heard advice where, to a young man, look at your girlfriend's mother.
Because that's what she'll look like in 40 years. That's right.
Like when she grows up.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I guess there's the truth in that. And if you like your future mother-in-law, you've got a very nice.
Well, yes, but that's not the basis on which you love someone. Love is a bit of a mystery, You don't pick so rationally, I don't think. But anyway, that's I think we all. It's nice to have such mysteries. It's nice to have such mysteries.
Well, we've run a little bit over time, but I think we had a lot of really good questions that came out of this discussion. I want to thank Dr. Nadia, Father Gabriel, and Tania for your time on this Sunday evening to discuss this really important issue. I think, some of these topics could probably be run over a number of talks because we've only just touched, I suppose, on some of these issues. And I'm sure that people later on in the days to come will be thinking about this topic and other questions will come up. So I'm hoping and praying that in 2021, we'll have an opportunity to hold more of these talks to give people the opportunity to ask further questions. And hopefully we help to support our families through times that are not easy. There were times when society was far more conservative and
predictable.
Exactly. Today, I think we do very much feel isolated. I think that question about the boundaries and what other people think, we do feel more and more isolated as Christians, which I don't think is surprising. They will look to us as being the strange ones. Mm-hmm. That's biblical. They will look at us.
They always did.
Well, they always did. But I think it's even becoming more profound in our times. So thank you to our panel. Thank you to everybody for tuning in and for participating and asking your questions and for being patient. Thank you very much, Father Nicholas Cathedral, for organising the panel and actually for coming up with the topic and your support for this service. And Father Gabriel, could I ask you to please conclude with "It is truly meet"?
I don't have the yes in English.
Oh, you can do it in that's fine.
Достойно есть яко воистину, блажите тебя, Богородицу, пресноблаженную и пренепорочную, и Матерь Бога нашего, честнейшую и херувим, и славнейшую, без сравнения Серафим, изъяснение Бога словородшую, сущую Богородицу, тебя величаем. Thank you, Father, and everyone. I derived a great deal of benefit for myself from this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we go with that.
Thank you, we all do.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody.
Nice to see you all.
Have a good night. Happy New Year to you all. God
Yes,
bless.
Happy New Year to you all too. Yeah, welcome.
Good night.